Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Needs Some Introduction. Right off the top, just a count of the number of subscribers we have on YouTube. We have a challenge for everybody out there. If you haven't subscribed for our channel on YouTube, we're trying to get to 100, and we'll do some kind of episode with some video content. Most likely just Sona and I having a conversation here with cameras on, so you can all see us and we can see each other while we're recording. And I want to shout out and thank listener Adam, who's reached out to us a few times with some very complimentary things. I think Sona, I forward you some of the feedback he's given us about our previous conversations.
So nice.
I was talking about how it's kind of hard to find our podcast on YouTube, and he mentioned that I could edit some of these things that might make it easier to find. My experience after making the changes that he suggested, I haven't actually found it easier to find from a YouTube search, but it was very helpful because I was just assuming that after I created the podcast feed, everything was pretty much locked down. But for example, I changed the name of our handle here when we respond to users to just Need Some Introduction instead of having this weird number on the end. And I changed the name of the podcast to Need Some Introduction Podcast. So made some changes there, which aesthetically makes a lot more sense. And maybe that'll trickle down and make it more searchable and easy to find. Anybody who hasn't subscribed yet and had trouble finding us, just a reminder that it's in the show notes. Click there, subscribe. And when that video episode becomes available, of course, you'll be notified.
That was so nice of Adam. Much appreciated.
Yes. Thank you so much, Adam. Love all your feedback and all that helpful. But you know what? There's a lot of just editing these episodes and getting them out is a lot of work. So I'm glad that someone said, you could actually change those things. And I did indeed change them and include links to the letterboxd and our email address and just all the things there. So once again, if you subscribe, all that information is there anyway. Just a good rule of thumb, you'll be notified when new episodes become available, even if you don't listen to them there. And thank you again, Adam. And of course, on the podcast, we are about to finish this final episode of Paradise on Tuesday is when the episode drops, and we will be recording, Darren and I, that night and publishing on Wednesday. A very eventful week this week of that show. So if there's a time, Sona, if you wanted to binge the show, this weekend's a good time to binge it because we're only a week away and big stuff happened this week. Big stuff.
Well, keep that in mind.
One more thing for you to watch. And of course, The White Lotus, it's a slow start to the season, to be honest. I've heard some people complaining about it. I think this is all groundwork right now.
I'm really enjoying it.
I know. I think you're enjoying it more than most people are, but that's not. I don't mean that in a derogatory way.
You're an outlier.
Yes, you might be the outlier here. I've heard people grumbling that it's a little slow, but it serves two purposes. One, as this little bit of a resort getaway of the mind, just to appreciate the beauty of it. And of course, the darkness lingering underneath, the dread. Darren watches the show with his wife and mentions that one of the things he likes about it is that there's this luxurious presentation of what we're seeing, but there's this constant dread. And I rewatched the show with my wife this week. She hadn't had a chance to see it yet. I did think about that. There's things I didn't shout out on the podcast where we see this camera early on in the night when everyone's asleep, and the camera's roving through the resort as it's deserted, or out far at sea and you see the like floating in the water, and that music is playing, and there is some creeping dread. And of course we know that death is coming for someone, so I guess that is part of what we're presenting.
Listen, these people have been at the resort for one full day. What do people want to have happened by now?
We did get a little action this week, right? Actually,
I know, but everybody's still jet lagged. Cut them a break.
Good point. They'll get to all the shenanigans within the week or so. And of course, we'll continue to cover that for the rest of its run. There are 2 episodes down, 6 episodes to go. All right, let's talk about Severance. We have this week's episode. I actually thought this would be a relatively quiet episode. Surprising that we have so many revelations this week in this show. I really do wonder what the chatter on this is going to be because there is so much information here. Oh, I did want to mention that the number one podcast, I think, on Apple Podcasts right now is, I shouldn't even shout this out because everyone's going to immediately stop listening here and jump over.
Oh, no.
But it is the official Severance podcast with Adam Scott and Ben Stiller. I've been not listening to the podcast intentionally because I don't want it to affect or actually intimidate me into even bothering to cover the show, to be honest with you. And I finally listened to an episode of it, and it is excellent. It is really good. So if I do highly recommend. It's very funny to hear them talk about the show. They speculate on things the way we do and come to similar conclusions that we did, for example, in last week's episode. And I find it very funny. I'm like, don't you guys know what's happening? Why are you
Right.
guys
Are these
speculating on
done in
intentions?
some sort of real-time revelation of the script? I don't understand.
Oh, definitely not, because they, for example, we're talking about one of the episodes I just started listening to. I didn't get very far into it. Was the Woe's Hollow episode, and Ben Stiller says to Adam Scott, "Can you believe that we shot that in March of 2023? So that
Wow.
2 entire
Wow.
years ago, right? We're just 1 month shy of 2 years." And they were like commenting on that. Wow, been 2 years. I can't believe it. 2 years.
That's so
And I'm
strange
like,
that they would
why did it
speculate
take
on
so long for this
anything.
show to come out? It's so crazy. I know there was the writer's strike, but that was like 3 or 4 months. That this still doesn't
Mm.
explain a 2 year window and delay. But yeah, for whatever reasons, it took much longer than expected. But it's still funny to hear them speculating on things. And it really makes me wonder, like, who is the holder of the keys of the mysteries to the show? If Stiller is speculating on things, I do wonder if Dan Erickson, the writer, my assumption based on these conversations is that Stiller seems to be very involved with massaging the story as it is told, but that maybe Erickson is the one who knows all the mysteries in his own head, and then he is doling them out over
Mhm.
the course of these seasons. Anyway, it's a great show. Please do listen to us also. So this episode, as we teased last week, is called the Chikhai Bardo, which is ego death. So a little more research. I mentioned it in passing last week. I had only done 2 seconds of Google search based on my pulling up the title in real time as we were recording. So I did a little more research here. So in Buddhism, there are 6 bardos. There are 3 bardos in life and 3 bardos in death. This is the first bardo. The Chikhai Bardo is the first bardo of death. So it's a transition between life and death. And if we consider that some kind of limbo, we see multiple limbos here in this particular episode. Oh, another thing I want to correct from last week. I had mentioned that we had the same director for this episode as last, and maybe it was listed that way on IMDb, but that is not correct. We actually have here, I think very importantly, Jessica Lee Gagne, I think her name is, who is the director of photography, the cinematographer for most of the episodes of Severance. I think she's been the cinematographer for 13 of the 16 episodes we've seen. So the vast majority of them. And if you want to think about the visual style of the show, she is probably the most influential, and obviously having the same cinematographer, even as the directors and writers change, that's the consistency we have in the visuals here. It's apropos to a large extent that this is the only episode of the show that she's directed herself. She's usually been only the cinematographer. But when you think about how many different aesthetic styles and
Mm-hmm.
how many different kinds of setups needed to be done and different lighting schemes in
Mm-hmm.
different environments, it's like they might have been like, just let her direct the episode. She's going to have to do 90% of the work anyway.
No,
So,
this
but
was
just
beautiful. This
beautiful.
episode was absolutely beautiful.
Incredible. Think about how difficult it is, and we'll walk through it here, to be conveying this information without having like a narrator or something. This is purely being told
Mm-hmm.
visually. And of course, that's the editing as well. There's a lot of very impressive editing in this. It's this show, really. You think about how well designed, and I really mean that word, everything here is in the revelations of plot points, in the layers of character development, in the beautiful set design, in the lighting, in the different tones that are set visually throughout the show. Even in this one particular episode, it is impeccable design work and
Mm-hmm.
filmmaking, period. As we mentioned before, we started recording anyway, we're discussing some of the guest stars here. One is Robbie Benson, someone who was famous many decades ago, probably not famous when most listeners have even been alive. The one reference point culturally that people would know now is that he had a guest run on Friends. I don't even remember what character he played, honestly, and I did watch most of that show. And of course, he was the voice of Beast in Beauty and the Beast. Not famous for quite some time, and here he is. He's the one who was whistling and getting the dentist's implements, and now we find out how those dentist implements are being used in this particular episode. And the other big guest star is, of course, Sandra Bernhardt, who's 70 years old now and looks pretty great for 70, I got to say.
I agree. And I will always have a fondness for her because I saw her at a restaurant in the East Village about 20 years ago.
She hasn't changed that much. I think the most of the conversation we're going to have is going to be about this fugue state we see Mark is in, and then how that dovetails, interestingly, with this lived experience Gemma is currently having in this exports floor, in the testing floor, exports. I guess they reference to it as two different places. So let's just get some of the mechanics of the plot out of the way. We pick up immediately from where we left off last week. Devin is there. Ragabi's popped up from downstairs. What do you think about Ragabi here, where Devin is, I have this idea. By the way, pretty clever idea. I hadn't forgotten that there was the severed pregnant woman at the lodges where she was last year. And it starts to feel like nothing on the show is a coincidence, by the way. I think that's going to touch on other things that happen in this particular episode as well. But she starts thinking, well, if they can activate those innies in the cabins, then maybe we can get Mark in there and then talk to his innie. And
yeah, not a bad idea.
Who's the only person she knows who could potentially do this?
Cobell.
That she has contact with? Of course, it's Cobell / Selvig. And what do you think about Ragabi? She just like packs up her equipment and she's like, goodbye. Like,
time to go.
I think that this is mostly convenient plotting to get Ragabi out and maybe to get her in contact with Cobell to bring her back into the show, obviously. I was kind of shocked. I mean, she's been a pretty bad doctor previously and has lied to this patient about how, don't worry, things are much better now. He's like, how many people have you tried this on between Petey and me? And she doesn't answer the question as if she has had more experience. But then later on, sounds like she hasn't had more experience. So for her to walk out of this room, I don't understand it. It's like she doesn't have anybody else to experiment on. You'd figure she'd want to stick around just so that she had a patient. I mean, I don't know how long a list of potential candidates she has beyond this point.
First of all, is she even an actual doctor? Do we know?
That's a good point.
I mean, it feels like maybe she's just
a tech.
Maybe she's one of those doctors that has a PhD in poetry, right?
like Rickon.
And this has become a hobby for her. I do think as we see more of her, her character seems slightly unhinged herself, and maybe understandably so. I didn't really question the idea that the mention of Cobell's name would trigger her to be like, that's it. Those were the magic words. I'm out of here.
She's out.
It kind of made sense.
She's just like,
goodbye. Let the pieces fall where they may. I've done what I can.
Exactly.
I get what you're saying. It could largely be a plot device, but it also made sense to me.
I mean, she seems to be like just making really bad decisions as a character.
And I think I've been questioning her judgment lately. So in that way, it kind of all tracked.
I mean, when you consider the food she eats on a regular basis.
Exactly.
When Ragabi is packing up her stuff, very funny, by the way, though, she packs up her stuff and she just has like all piled up, like and she's just like, and even Devin's looking at that like that. What, we got to take her to the hospital. We can't just use that garbage you have over there. But also, as she's leaving, she goes, "You can't trust Cobell. She's going to turn you in immediately. She's a true believer. She was raised by them." And of course, this goes back to that shrine she had where we saw her like a diploma that she got from like the Egan School for Girls. So there is some truth that Ragabi knows Cobell's backstory and knows that, yeah, Cobell was probably in one of these, not probably, Cobell was definitely in one of these schools that the Egans run that were probably brainwashing them with their own philosophy and these and preparing them for one of these roles later in life. So she's been inside of the Lumen cult her whole entire life. So yeah, she's probably right to not trust her at all.
Although I just want to say, I do think Cobell is beginning to question things, right? After her most recent experiences. So
she doesn't call Cobell in the moment, but I do think she is going to reach out to her. And as you mentioned, I think the show did a very smart thing here in Ragabi reminding us all that, yeah, she's been inside of Lumen forever, her whole entire life. She is obviously a true believer, or definitely was, until we saw her have that crisis of faith and smash all those artifacts last year, towards the end of the season. But like you mentioned, she wanted to get back into Lumen and then backs out, right? Like she doesn't trust them either. I think the show very cleverly leaves that as a dangling possibility. Maybe if Devin approaches her, she reaches out to Lumen and goes, I have what you want. Or maybe she's like, I want to burn it all down. Like, and we don't know which
Right.
direction she's in,
Exactly.
where she's at. So
Mm-hmm.
I do think that, and I do think that there's no way that they don't bring back the Cobell character before the end of the season.
I agree.
Absolutely not. You know what I just realized? I wonder if Ragabi, this is something I hadn't considered before. What if she is reintegrated herself? Because she mentions that people who are reintegrated get very hungry,
Mm-hmm.
and she's constantly snacking.
True.
So is she reintegrated, which would be interesting? And then I assumed that she was a doctor because at one point she says, I'm the one who put the chip in his head or into somebody's head. I forget who she mentions. So maybe she was one of these techs. Just because she was a tech doesn't mean she's a doctor. And then she says,
Right.
oh, I have this space in the university. What if she's somebody who's been reintegrated and now she's trying to do this for somebody else? But maybe she's not the originator of this procedure. The worst thing would be that Cobell shows up and says, that's not Dr. Ragabi.
Can you imagine?
That's just one of the kooky innies who's trying to replicate this process. That would be a shocking revelation. And I think that's the only real plot that happens outer world. Everything else, of course, is these revelations back to the inside of Mark's head, what's happening in that reintegration process, which of course I had said, hey, I want to see something like this. Well, I got way more than I possibly expected, almost an entire episode of it.
I don't know if it was clear and I missed it. It was hard for me to distinguish what was happening inside Gemma's head and what was happening inside Mark's head. Was it clear to you?
I think that what is happening there is Gemma's having memories of the relationship. And then there is the reintegration process where Mark is remembering all these, or not remembering them because he already did, but reliving them. But in a way, his innie is having these memories for the first time. But I think what's happening is that they're using the shared memories as a bridge between moving from his head to obviously the experience she's having, which only she can have those memories, right? Just the.
I was thinking of the memories of their relationship.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think they're probably shared memories, and they're actually using that as a bridge to move from one story to the other. That's my guess as to what's being presented there. They mentioned this in that little featurette at the end of the episode. It's only like 1 or 2 minutes long. Ben Stiller mentions the fact that Dichen Lachman, who's this actress who plays Gemma, who's been relatively, used here and there, but not like a huge player across the show, although she's been in the show, but she's never really had to carry a lot of emotional weight. For this episode, she really needed to create the character of Gemma, not of Miss Casey, but of Gemma. Really, in a way, her performance is creating the character, and they were really impressed with it. And I have to say, I am so impressed with this. She's created a character we care about in minutes. It's an amazing piece of acting.
I think it was so impressive, and I think it filled a gap that the show really needed in that so much of this story is now being driven by Mark trying to reunite with Gemma. And we understand objectively this is his wife that he thought was dead. Imagine you thought your spouse was dead and they're alive. And all of that, we can understand it on an intellectual level. But I think the emotional piece was missing of the love that they had for each other and the feeling on an emotional level, the grief that he has by losing her. I think they did a lot in this episode to connect the viewer with that experience on an emotional level instead of just an intellectual level.
My wife was riveted to this episode. At the end of it, she was like, best episode ever. And I think it is exactly what you're describing, where the show maybe didn't have an emotional anchor because it's been so much about the mythology. And even if you just think about it as a conspiracy thriller, and when you watch those films as well, you're paranoid, you don't trust anybody, so it's hard to emotionally connect to even what you're seeing. And of course that's very much what the show is, and there has been some emotional connection to the Helly and Mark relationship, but I think she really emotionally connected with this episode. So in a way, like you said, I think it's something necessary that maybe emotionally connects people to the show. And it's interesting. I don't know if it was always designed this way, but I think the show has improvised this in getting to this point where you do think about how in season one, oh, look, they're just these silly innies with these worker drones and they follow the mantra and they have no real personality. And we really don't see much of the outside world. And that was the joke, the satire of season one. But now when you see these people as they were, you see what we've lost from this version of them. Not only obviously the innies who have this much limited life experience, but the outies too. Like Mark Outie has never had the emotional colors, shades that we see in those flashbacks, right? Like not only the romantic scenes, but just the way they casually hanging out with the sister. Rickon is like a different version of Rickon. They bust his chops, but there's a kindness to it. Like we're all in on the joke. It is completely different versions of him. And you really realize how damaged he was from losing her. And I think my wife just really connected to all of that.
I mean, it was beautifully done. It felt like you were watching the whole thing through some kind of golden filter, right? Of like the days gone by and how happy everybody was and how beautiful it was. And I will say also the infertility stuff was done really nicely as well. I think very powerful and very accurate in its portrayal of how devastating that is.
Yeah, I don't know if that touched the nerve for you at all.
Obviously, having experienced infertility, it's something I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And I think it's a very specific sisterhood of women that have gone through that. And it's something that if you haven't gone through it yourself, it's impossible to understand how devastating it is and what a dark place it can put you in and how desperate it can make you to just latch on to anything that promises some hope. And I mean, I think we see the consequences of that, here in this episode. I don't think I've had the easiest life. I don't think I've had the worst life, but nothing compares to the darkness of infertility. Easily the hardest thing I have ever been through in my life. And the effect too that it has not only on you internally, but on your relationship. It's the hardest thing to go through in a relationship because I think the woman and the man experience it differently, handle it differently. It throws off your entire dynamic. It's just brutal on every front.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, even I seeing it from the outside. Oh, your son's birthday, how was
Yes, after all the infertility talk, we did 8 years ago, almost to the day, get our little miracle. His birthday was great. He had breakfast in bed at his request, off to school where they did a birthday celebration, then off to soccer where they did a birthday celebration, then off to grandma's where we had cupcakes, opened some gifts along the way, did some homework before bed, and now his first full day as an 8-year-old is today.
There was during that rough patch, we weren't all aware of what was happening, but we hadn't seen you as much. So now we know that you were probably on a severed floor somewhere
for 6.5 years.
And then you finally came out and with the child in tow.
And that is one of the things about infertility is some people are comfortable sharing, and for some people it's so painful that they can't share it. And I was in that second group of people. So yeah, very few people knew what was going on. And, there's so much more that is not the subject of this podcast. But in the end, we were very, very lucky. I will leave it at that.
And that's a teaser for our new podcast, Fertility Today. Just kidding. But I'm glad it all turned out. And your son is a pleasure, as always, and full of energy, always.
Always, yes.
So it all worked out. And ironic that, 8 years to the day and pretty much when you're watching this show as well.
Yeah, that is a good point. That is ironic.
Oh, by the way, in those early flashbacks, the meet cute at the blood drive
Mm-hmm,
where they sit
mm-hmm.
next to each other. And my wife was immediately like, Adam Scott looks so much better with short hair.
Oh my gosh, so much better.
And I think that's very intentional. You're seeing him way down, like hiding behind this mop of hair. I called it wig like in a previous
Mm-hmm.
episode. He seems lighter in every possible way. Adam Scott, once again, giving a great performance here, surprising the way that he can not only show us this more charismatic version of the character, but you see how he gets darker, but it's not the version of Mark we've seen here. It is this frustrated and angry and unable, as you would expect in relationships in general, not specifically to infertility, but of course, we've probably all had those relationships when the dynamic is changing in a negative way within a relationship. You can't really talk about it. It's too tender to talk about. You see how they are growing apart. And this is not only done in these incredible performances, basically, once again, Adam Scott giving an incredible performance here, and Deachin Lackman, who has done little other than be this one note Miss Casey character, usually for comedic purpose when she's doing these therapeutic sessions, and giving all of these different versions of her, this incredible glowing love object that he adores early on, and then how she darkens as these issues come up in her relationship, in the marriage itself. And the scene where Adam Scott is frustrating and not able to assemble a crib that they may not need, is, just the thought of that one image is so haunting. And of course, that the cinematography gets darker and darker until we have the final day where the police show up and you see him step back into complete darkness, right? That's really where we've seen him now. All of this is just beautifully visually conveyed. A couple of things, plot points that I think are important, are not clearly explained, and intentionally so, I guess. Dylan had stolen some card from O&D last season, and we see that there is this card of a person fighting themselves, and that Gemma innately recognizes that this represents ego death, which of course is synonymous with the Chikhai Bardo, the name of this episode of the show. And I had a couple of questions. So this is how Lumen is recruiting her, by sending her these test cards. It seems that, and I'm inferring here, but tell me if you agree or not, that this started when they went to that fertility clinic, and then maybe she signed up for something, and then she filled in some kind of questionnaire, which very much, once again, sounds like not only Scientology, but I remember when I was younger that there were these almost like cults that would advertise on TV, and you take these personality tests, and then you would go off to these retreats. And it seems like maybe something more in kind with those type of self-help cults that formed at that time. It probably still exists now, maybe even more so with social media. I'm just not as familiar with them. It seems like they're preying on her because of that. Do you think they've promised her guaranteed childbirth or something? Like, how do you think they've recruited her?
I think it definitely is something fertility related. I do know one of the hardest things for me going through infertility and IVF was everything you're going through is so hard on your body. It is so hard emotionally, and there is no guarantee that it will work.
Right.
And I always thought I could bear anything if you could tell me it's definitely going to work.
Right.
What's making this torture is that I am putting myself through this with no guarantee I will ever have a child. And so I just know that if you had told me, if you do X, I will absolutely guarantee you will have a child, I would have bent over backwards to do X. And she even has a conversation with him of, what if it doesn't work?
Right.
And that's what everybody goes through, is I'm doing all of this and spending all this money, by the way, as well. If you don't have amazing insurance coverage, which hardly anybody has, what if it doesn't work? That's the question you live with for a very long time.
And then in that last night, when she leaves, how do you read that scene? I have read one recap so far today, and the recap author said she obviously says goodbye to him in a way where I'm not going to see you in a while. I didn't read it that way, but you do feel like there's a finality to it. I mean, from his perspective, it is a final. He thinks she's dead at that point. I mean, I guess we'll know more later, but if you're going to speculate, did you think she knew that they were going to fake her death? Think about what you're doing to your spouse in that moment? And do you think that even a promise of a child at the end of it, that it's going to be all forgiven?
I think it could equally be read both ways because, first of all, she does say, "Are you sure you don't want to come?"
Right. Yes.
So, to charades, and it's only going to be 20 minutes of charades. If you were set on this plan to fake your own death, I don't know, maybe if you're ambivalent about it, you would kind of be like, let fate decide. If he decides he's coming to
Right.
charades, we're not doing this. I guess that's happening. That could happen. As far as that final, I love you. I don't know about you, but I've definitely had that experience where you say something as you're walking out the door and the other person is watching TV or whatever, and you're like,
Yep.
hey, I'm talking to you.
Right.
So I don't think it can definitely be read as a final goodbye for those reasons. But I think it's equally plausible that she wanted to make sure he heard her say, hey, I love you, because she
Right.
knew that something was going to get set into motion that night that would mean she doesn't see him for a while.
I have to assume that she does not know that they're going to fake her death. But then she seems to know about it now, right? Because, like, let's use that as a transition into her current lived experience, which, once again, a completely different aesthetic style. I just want to shout it out before I forget to, that this whole sequence at the end, when she's running through the hallway and it's mostly black and you just see the lights where the people are walking, it was just so beautiful. And this
Mm-hmm.
really evocative of those 1970s sci-fi paranoid thrillers, and so brazen in a way to be like, we're going to make most of the screen black and just assume people can follow along. Just really great decisions.
Yeah, really beautiful.
But Gemma, it's purgatory, literally, as described in like Dante's Inferno, or
Mm-hmm.
the where you have this limbo area of the same repetitive tasks. It literally is that. And what is going on here? There's so many revelations, and you probably are less interested in this, but probably equally compelled by Gemma's predicament. So the mechanics of this appear to be that she, and tell me if you disagree with any of this, because it is unexplained. She goes into each one of these 6 rooms. There's 6 rooms she has visited. There is a 7th room that now has a name, Cold Harbor, which of course we know correlates to the file that is 96% complete now, by the way. So he has been productively cleaning that. But now they say the nosebleed set him back. So I guess he hasn't been back to the office. We know why, because he's having a mental breakdown of a kind, literally. But she's been to these 6 rooms. Now it seems that the innie that goes into each one of those rooms is not only a separate innie, it is also not Miss Casey, correct?
Yes, I agree with that. I haven't fully grasped the logistics of how this is happening,
Mm-hmm.
but like the outside version of Gemma is inside
Yeah.
currently.
Yes.
And
And that's
then,
Gemma with her memories. She remembers
right,
Mark. She
of
remembers.
Mark and wanting
Yeah.
to get back to Mark. And she is aware that inside versions of her are
Yes.
being created for different purposes because she says, oh, how many rooms today? Right.
Right.
And then a different inside version of Gemma is getting sent into each room, I think.
Right. Yes. It seems to be because when she goes to get her teeth cleaned,
Right.
he says it's been
Seems
six
like it might have
weeks.
been more than a cleaning, but yeah.
Yes. I know, right? She has pain after it. But I mean, a 2-hour tooth cleaning can also leave you sore.
True.
But he says this is the Robbie Benson character who plays these different characters in each one of these nightmare scenarios, says it's been 6 weeks since she got her teeth cleaned, which still is too frequent to clean your teeth, by the way.
Way too frequent.
She's like, she needs a break. And he goes, there's no break. She hasn't been there in 6 weeks. But of course, her experience of it is not that.
Can you imagine the entirety of your memories
Yes.
being at the dentist?
Yes.
What a waking nightmare. Holy cow.
They're giving everybody actual PTSD intentionally, those innies. And then he's asking her, Gemma, the version of Gemma, who is the outie version of Gemma, with all the preserved memories of Mark and etc. Does she have any carryover from each one of those? And she says, well, I had soreness in my tooth. So it seems to be, or
Mm-hmm.
my hand hurts later on.
Mm-hmm.
So there's physical carryover, obviously. The body keeps the score. Back to
Mm-hmm.
a reference from before. But he asks her, does she have a particular feeling? Was there a particular room she dreaded going into more? And she can't say she doesn't have any recollection of that. So they're trying to see if this boundary between the selves is truly holding. This is literally dialogue that Drummond speaks at one point, is the partition holding between the innie and the outie. That's part of the experiment that's being done here. How much can you compartmentalize successfully? And here's the other thing I thought about. Are these fears that she might represent? Mark says to her at one point, she goes, if I get pregnant, I'll have to send a lot of thank you notes. And he goes, you hate writing thank you notes. So then she has one of her limbos is just forever writing thank you notes. Forever.
Christmas every day.
Every day. Christmas every day, writing thank you notes for every single gift that she receives. Then we have the dentist chair. So is she afraid of dentists? We have that really bad flight, obviously, in one of the rooms. Pretty comedic, by the way. And she has to have her hair done before she goes in there. I like the different stylings, by the way. So they're all really nice fits for her. But
well, and the handbag, where is she going that she needs a handbag?
I know, right? I guess it should make the illusion complete. But I mean, that woman's always getting onto a bad flight and is afraid of flights. Once again, is this desensitization of the experience? Is the idea to have someone go through their worst nightmare and then ensure that they're not carrying that trauma over into their other self? So that seems to be what we're seeing here. So all of this is pretty intriguing, especially the fact that they can create like infinite innies because all these different versions of her seem to be separate from each other. It doesn't seem to be like, oh, here I am getting my teeth cleaned. Now I'm on a plane. This one again. These do not seem to be overlapping experiences, right?
Yes, but at the same time, like that inside version is a consistent inside version because she remembers being at the dentist. I was just here.
Right. Exactly.
So it's not you're continually creating new ones. Like you're creating a specific, this is the one that goes to the dentist.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's consistency there. So they can track each one of these different.
Yeah. And then like re-access it.
So that's kind of fascinating. And maybe they're trying to see how many they could add. And yeah, the question remains that she obviously is complicit and understands the goal of the experiment. She is a bit of a believer, I would assume. But apparently here, she is at the end of her rope and maybe starts to feel she doesn't really have escape from this situation.
It definitely feels like a cult or, I think there are a lot of Scientology references here of promises being made. You're not really in that deep. You're not really that committed. You can leave anytime you want. And then when push comes to shove, you realize like, no, I'm actually stuck here.
I think, by the way, this is my speculation on just the structure of the season. That's going to be the punchline or the big reveal in the last episode or next to last episode, but near the end of this season will be that Cold Harbor will complete. I mean, we're 96% complete. I'm pretty sure we'll get to 100%. That's a question as to whether he comes back now integrated and lays his cards on the table with Helena, for example. And they're like, look, do you want to see Gemma again? You need to finish that file. Or if he goes in there and plays dumb as Innie Mark. If of those two, would you like to see him go undercover as Innie Mark or to lay his cards on the table and meet Helena and just say, here's the deal? And they're like, okay, you know what's going on now, but guess what? You still got to finish that file. It's the only way to see Gemma again. Of those two possibilities, which one would you prefer?
I think this show already gives my brain a little bit of overload. I would probably prefer the second because I would find it easier to follow along.
Rather than thinking about the double identities and all that stuff, right? I actually think I would like him undercover because I always like that kind of spy show better. The idea that he would go in there as Innie Mark, work on the file, but then he would, with intentionality, go to the elevator, go down to the lower floor, and of course not be severed during that process. I wonder what would happen to him anyway if he was just a regular Innie, because we see Gemma become Miss Casey when she goes to the elevator. So I wonder what the trigger in that elevator is. They're very curious about all these things. But I think I would like to see, oh, you know what? I take that back. With so few episodes left, I'd like to see a season of that. I don't know if I want to see that whole other layer to the story with only 3 episodes to go. There's not enough space left in the show for all of that. He needs to just lay his cards on the table and say, look, I know what's going on. I want to see Gemma. I'm going to go public with this information. And they'll be like, well, you're not, because you got to finish that file. And that's the only way to see Gemma. And then what's behind door number 7? That's going to be the mystery, or the tease for next season. But I think they will show us what's there, and then that'll just open the mystery up in a different direction.
More goats.
That could be the goat room. Um, it doesn't seem to be like that is just another trick they're playing. They literally tell the doctor that, the one who's torturing her, basically, you're attached to her, but once that file is cleansed and she goes into that room, basically this experiment is over. So whatever happens in that room is the end of the line. Hopefully not for Gemma. I mean, that could be the end of the line.
Right, right.
And then therefore they wouldn't need him anymore. Speaking of all that, this is so frustrating. So Gemma says, will I see Mark? And what happens once I've seen all the rooms? And he says, you will see the world again, and the world will see you. Mark will benefit from the world you're siring. Kier will take away all his pain, just as Kier has taken away yours. And she says, can you please talk like a normal person? So she is like absolutely sick of this cult talk. She's like, I want a straight answer, for God's sakes. That's pretty much how you feel about this show too. So
it is. I relate.
Yeah, and then she knocks him out in the next scene.
Did you see that coming? I gasped.
I did not see her attacking him. No, I did not expect that. Yeah, and it's such a tragic twist. It really is this final knife in the heart of this episode, that she actually gets the card, actually makes a plan, actually gets on the elevator. And we know what's going to happen. She goes upstairs, she turns into Miss Casey, and Milchick's just like, get back on the elevator. And she does it. And then when she comes back to, it's like Helly waking back up in the elevator. Oh my God. I'm back here again. It never ends. She's in this hell that she's trapped in forever.
What about the cruelty of saying Mark has moved on, he remarried, he has a daughter? So cruel. And I was so happy that she at least has the awareness of these people to say, no, you're lying.
Right. I'm glad about that too. And by the way, even if she fears that in her heart of hearts, what's the alternative? She's going to stay down there forever? I don't even know why he's cruelly telling her that, other than he wants to believe that she loves him. I find it very funny that he reads that scene as like, I have feelings for you. And I'm starting to think, I'm pretty sure you have feelings for me too. The way she says, I love you to him, obviously, I mean, even someone as socially backward as him should understand that that is not what she means. She's not saying I love you with her eyes. That's for sure. Quite the opposite. Yeah, and I want to get some like Lumen conspiracy stuff out of the way. Probably your least favorite part of all this, but I do want to shout it out. As we're moving between Mark's reintegrated mind and Gemma's memories, we see these 4 guys at a terminal. One of the guys at the terminal is seeing Mark. So his file that he's cleansing is Mark's file, Mark's innie file, because every single time we see him, he's sitting at his computer. And there are multiple scenes where we see Gemma present there with him, and they are grabbing these numbers off the screen like that, as MDR has been doing. But it did make me wonder, like, are they in real time removing the possible memories that might reconnect him to her? And is that what's kind of happening with these refinement numbers? And of course, he is, we know, it's like a Russian nesting doll. He is doing the same thing to Gemma's file as well. So do you think that's kind of what we're seeing represented there?
I agree that there's some sort of link to the memories that you have and the emotional responses to them. But I'm unclear logistically how this works, because it feels like you'd be on a very tight deadline to grab those, no?
Yeah, I mean, maybe they're looking for them as they pop up and maybe it's easier to identify them when you're inciting the experiment itself. This actually makes me think of the Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind movie. Was written based on a scientific study. And I don't know if you're aware of this, Sona. There is, I forget the name of the compound. It's called GABA or something like that. When you make a memory, you require a certain protein, and that protein encodes the memory in your neurons. But the other thing that's interesting about memory is every time you remember something, you distort your memory of it because you actually
Mm-hmm.
retrieve it
Mm-hmm.
and then you write it. And every time it's a copy of a copy of a copy. So every time if you really ruminate on something, whatever you're ruminating on, the version of it that you actually ruminate upon is significantly different than the original. There is this compound that they give to people who have PTSD. It's a blocker for writing the memory. So they make you relive this really traumatic experience in a therapeutic session while they give you this compound, which blocks the write to the neurons. Every time you recollect it, you can't rewrite it. So you're removing, you can't obviously erase an entire memory like they do in Eternal Sunshine, where they literally map the neurons and go like zap, 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 and they're all gone. You can't actually do that because memories involve smell, and taste, and touch, and there are associations between memories to each other. So it's not so clean like they do here in Severance, where you could just sever somebody in half. But it is interesting, this idea that you recall something, and then by blocking the right, perhaps the most painful aspects of that memory get removed. So on the one hand, if you are completely debilitated by your PTSD, that would be a positive thing. But on the other hand, imagine overdoing this and being able to erase a painful relationship, for example, or childbirth or something like that, like we see explicitly here, by being able to, even if you just dampen it by 95%, so it's barely a memory anymore, don't you learn from those experiences? And aren't those part of you, even if they are negative? And of course, maybe that's what's being explored here, is this idea of just removing something from you. But I do wonder if this is like an experiment, basically doing that with this device where you trigger a painful memory. Like when he starts to, we see this in flashback multiple times. I think this is very important. At one point when he's in the wellness room and he gets to just make something out of clay, he makes the tree that she crashed into. This is back in season 1. And the fact that the innie mark makes this tree raises a question, of course, that there is something inside that is not being erased fully by the severing process. But maybe as those memories bubble up, they're actually removing them because they see them, the activity of them. That's the one that becomes most activated, and they're actually removing them from their persona via the technology that's in their heads.
Right.
So,
I mean, all of that makes sense to me theoretically, but wouldn't
yeah,
you have to have people working around the clock on this?
that's true. Well, that's a fact, right? But I mean, I guess you have a relatively clean slate because what you do is the innies have removed all the other baggage. And then what you're doing is you're actually like introducing, like putting him in the room with Miss Casey. You can imagine during a therapy session being there and someone's watching him at that moment, removing those memories. Or for example, when he's doing the clay, making the tree in the wellness room, whatever memories are bubbling up at that moment, they are suppressing them, right? And therefore it never crosses that barrier, right? The barrier is holding, or what does he say? Are the barriers holding? Drummond is there supervising. We don't see who else is on there, right? We only see his face, but there are 4 people there, so there are other people, and maybe they're all working on him. Like,
Yeah, it just feels like you would never even be able to step away to go to the bathroom or eat lunch or get a drink of water because
well,
who knows what that inside person is doing during that time period.
Well, that's why I said they maybe all 4 of them. I was assuming they're
Yeah.
all working on different files. Maybe they're all working on Mark, right? Like in real time. That's how important this is. I have a question though there. How do they get Gemma if Mark's the only one who could cleanse her file? Are they so manipulative that they got Mark to join Lumen for this project?
I mean, this is kind of what I always speculated. They first targeted her for whatever reasons, and then they knew that that would send him into such a deep depression that, much like a cult, right? Like they look for people who are damaged and going through a lot of stuff and looking for something to save them, that he would be like susceptible to the severance process, and then targeted him, maybe not overtly, in subtle ways to guide him to volunteer to be severed, is what I had always assumed.
Maybe that is part of the experiment, is to have the death be so traumatic that they then
Yeah.
lean on him to get him to
Yeah.
become a severed. And that was all part of the plan from the beginning. That's more nefarious than I actually thought. I was thinking more innocently that it could be just happenstance. she fills in this, she's obviously going through a rough time. She's looking for answers. She fills in this personality survey innocently. It turns out to be some kind of recruitment, which once again, we do see in the real world. He, so depressed, basically picks up those cards, fills in the same questions, and hears about the severance process and goes, well, there's a way out. But once again, you might be right.
I always
That
thought it was like a long game that they've been, yeah.
Yeah, that it's not like then he thought about severance, that maybe they intentionally had him befriend somebody and they bring up severance,
Right.
again, like little by little nudging him in that direction.
Yeah.
That's actually all good points. And maybe that is more realistic than him just happening to show up there. So maybe they wanted to have someone who's emotionally traumatized trying to cleanse a spouse's whoever they're close to, their file themselves. And then they engineered the entire thing. And maybe there's other similarly tragic stories inside of Lumen, which is really cruel when you think about that as a reality.
Yeah, I doubt they're running this on only one test subject. I mean, that would be really poor scientific protocol to just have a single test subject.
In all of those cubes, we see those rooms that she's staying in, for example, that there's probably others around. They don't interact with each other. So, of course, whoever is shepherding her, the nurse who's shepherding her from one experience to the next, open one door, you take them out, you take them to their room, and there's no overlap. But that inside those different rooms, there are different nightmare scenarios particular to those particular. And that's why O&D has to always be manufacturing these props, because they need them for all these different kinds of experiences, right? You need to like decorate the inside of a plane for one experience. You need to, this is a theory that's been going around, that they never left the office and that the entire Ortbo was in a virtual location. I don't actually believe that, because that would be just way too complex for them. It does make sense that, for example, if you're in a fuselage of a plane, you could replicate that pretty easily. There's amusement park rides that function that way. But to create this entire experience where they can like walk for half an hour and think about the complexity of that design. So I don't believe that. And I also think that they would be able to pretty easily like turn off the water if this is all an illusion, and that he's just drowning her in like a small pool of water. They're at the top of a waterfall, right? They're a great distance from her. Or Milchick could just like reach out his hand and say, turn off the simulation. But that's not what it is, right? He literally needs to climb down the rocks to go rescue her. So all that is to say that I don't believe that theory at all. but we do see a fake reality here for sure.
The Ortbo thing doesn't sound super plausible to me, but who knows?
I would not enjoy that as a twist.
Agree.
This being like, oh, they create like a New York City apartment in the 1950s or something. It's very strange, some of these set designs. That's, you decorate one room. You do that all the time for a movie. That's not that complicated, as opposed to like creating a whole outdoor space, which doesn't.
Right.
It makes more sense what they're hinting at there, that this is an actual Egan-controlled preserve of some kind. So I think, anyway, I think that's probably more likely. And they can control that exterior environment, obviously. Of these hells that and we only saw 3 of them, by the way, so there's 6 of these hells that she has to go through. Did you have a particular one that you hated the most?
I was going to ask you what your personal torture room would be. I haven't given it too much thought, but I definitely identified with the dentist one. I really, really hate going to the dentist. I feel like I have some level of dental trauma by just genetically not having great teeth. I feel like the hygienist is always judging me. There's just so many pokey things in my mouth. I have TMJ disorder that gets aggravated every time I'm there.
Possibly that's what's happening with Gemma too.
Yeah, I really dread the dentist. What about you?
Of these 3, probably the dentist is the worst. I don't know, like writing those thank you notes is terrible also, for sure. An eternity of that. I just tedium in general, but the teeth at infinite, I was going to say, like, I really do like, despite not going to liking to get my teeth cleaned, I do like the feel of the clean teeth afterwards. So you do have that experience, but 2 hours of a dental cleaning, my jaw gets sore from a dental cleaning when it's open for like whatever, 20 minutes or half an hour. The idea of 2 hours, like, it's really sounds terrible, and more so than the others. I mean, with the plane crash, you would be like being on a roller coaster or something. And since you never actually crash, I assume that you just got at some point go like, well, I know I'm not going to crash, so you get. So maybe you can just enjoy it as an experience, as a roller coaster ride. So yeah, probably the dentist. If I was to have my own personal hell, it would probably be either being in a house where multiple kids are crying and I can't get them to stop crying forever. That would be really, really rough. The other one is I hate small talk. And the idea of like basically being put into a situation where whatever, I'm like a salesperson or something, and I have to keep this really, really uninteresting person occupied and they are not allowing me to not converse would be another kind of hellish experience for me for sure.
Mine would be, to circle back to my infertility trauma,
Oh,
gynecological procedures.
oh my God.
The worst,
Wow. Yeah, never thought about that.
especially the ones you're awake for.
Oh, God forbid that that is one of the experiences she's having right now. Oh, one more thing I wanted to bring up, the flashback to the four of them together and how their dynamic is so natural and so warm and so much fun. And even
Mm-hmm.
Rickon,
Mm-hmm.
bragging about how he used to scale these ice walls when he was a
Mm-hmm.
youngster. And it doesn't seem like he's bragging like an idiot like he does now. It actually seems like there's a certain air of confidence and you believe what he's saying. So it makes him
Mm-hmm.
like an oddball, but an endearing one. So the dynamic is so different there with the four of them. And I think
Mm-hmm.
about something we just explored last week when you removed Irv from the four, that the dynamic
Mm-hmm.
kind of fell apart. So it's a similar thing, I think, where I think they're definitely drawing that parallel. Gemma served some core purpose to their dynamic, and removing her has broken.
And the conversation that Mark and Devin had in the diner a few weeks ago, where he's, accusing her, it's not hurting you the same way it's hurting me, it doesn't
Right.
matter to you that she's gone the way it matters to me. And she's so devastated by that because it did really hurt her that what happened to Gemma.
Okay, so next week, the title of the episode is Sweet Vitriol, which is something we've seen in the show where you're combining two words that don't go well together. Sweet Vitriol. And the description on the Apple TV Plus app is discoveries are made.
Oh,
So,
okay.
not giving away too much this week. And yeah, we will touch base again next week when all of that becomes available. So, any final thoughts?
I just want to restate my appreciation for the aesthetics of this episode.
Yeah.
I think it felt completely different than any other Severance
Yeah.
episode that we've seen. I think it was beautiful to watch. I think it evoked a lot of emotions. I think an immense amount of work must have gone into creating this episode of television. And I think it was beautifully done. And in fact, like I found it a little bit jarring, the departure from the
Mm-hmm.
tone of everything we've seen before, but I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I thought it was beautiful. And for all the reasons you said, shocking in a way that the show has allowed itself to this late in the game to change its even color palette, its design palette, the style, the way that those flashbacks are photographed, for example, it just shows a whole different aspect to the show that it's aware of, that it's not cold, insulated version of the show. We, of course, knew it was designed, but it's not just a design. There is an intentionality to the counterpoint of the real world or the world before. I think this is like a pivot in the show at this moment. And it's exciting that it comes so pretty late into what we assume, whatever this run of the show is going to be. This is maybe halfway through or close to halfway through the run of the show, still expanding what the show is at this point. Once again, I'm so impressed.
It shows a lot of confidence
Yes.
on the
Mm-hmm.
part of the people making the show to wait until this long
Yes. Mm-hmm.
to show us all of this, right? At least the Gemma flashback stuff could have easily been worked in earlier. So I have to think it was a purposeful choice not to do that.
You raise a really excellent point with what you just said in the fact that it is pretty late in the game there is a version of the show hinted at by this episode where we are in the outside world and that is the majority of the show. And then there is this cult that is at odds with it. So you can imagine the show going in that direction, even if they wanted to. And like you mentioned, the fact that they have like restrained themselves from making that thematic in the show until this late in the going is a real confidence. Like I think that
Mm-hmm.
this goes back to that idea of how I got lost in watching Lost, not
Mm-hmm.
like in the plot of Lost, but in my emotional stakes of that show, probably by season two. And that this show is really almost like waiting until season two, near the end of season two, to give us these emotional hooks and
Yes,
and all with intentionalities. It gives me a lot of confidence that the show is knows exactly where it's heading.
I agree.
Yeah, thank you for those points, and I think it's a great way to frame where the show is at right now. All right, thank you, Sona. Have a great day, a great weekend.
You too.
Yes, and we will regroup next week and touch base again. And we'll see how close we are to that 100 threshold, and then we'll figure out
Exciting.
what are we actually going to do video wise. We'll figure it out. All right, thanks again.
Talk to you soon.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.